TrickBot is now using ActiveX controls as a trigger.
Hey Andy, it looks like you have an interesting story about TrickBot that you wanted to share.
Yes, I do. TrickBot is a very sophisticated baking malware, is what it is. It likes to change. It likes to morph. It likes to stay current. There's been a number of stories about TrickBot adding on different features and mechanisms to itself.
Yeah.
Well, we have another one in the news recently. So essentially, we have a researcher from AlienLabs actually discovered that a new version of TrickBot is actually using a new ActiveX control that's found in Windows 10.
Okay.
That's specifically for RDP. But they're not using it for remote management, which is interesting. That's the interesting part of things. So typically how you would get TrickBot is you would get a targeted email that would contain a macro script, and it would contain an image that says something like, hey, you need to enable macros, and then it would have its downloader, the OS tap downloader, which is something that TrickBot has recently adopted as its method to get more malware on the system. So the difference here is that the initial email is going to contain an ActiveX control for that Microsoft remote desktop. And when the researcher opened up the properties for that control, you see that there's a server named there, which is typically you'd put the server of the remote desktop that you want to add. That field is actually left blank, and it's left blank intentionally so. And the reason it's left blank is later on in the chain, so to speak, there's a DNS lookup that goes out, and it goes out looking for a blank entry, and so it actually comes back as not found. And so that's actually they use that as sort of a trigger.
I see.
To actually trigger the OS tap bat file to then execute and download more malware.
It's more kind of like a mutex. They're using blank entry as some sort of trigger in this case.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Interesting.
So it's a little different, and maybe in the future we'll see them use that ActiveX control as intended, where that server field is actually there's something in it, it's populated. But right now it's empty, and they're using it as a trigger, which is interesting.
Does it only affect Windows 10 systems or any other operating systems also?
So right now it's actually just Windows 10 and Windows Server 2016. And the reason why is that particular ActiveX control is actually a new control that came out with a recent version of Windows 10.
I see.
So one of the things that the author of the researcher that discovered all this went into that I thought was really interesting was the idea of all these new updates coming onto operating systems, introducing all these new potential vulnerabilities, right? He mentions that there's hundreds of new controls that are added that were added to Windows 10. And when you talk about the Windows model sort of changing a little bit from these big releases to sort of smaller incremental ones, it becomes a little bit more of a challenge to stay on top of every single control that's added. Because like he says, each one of them that's added is an opportunity for an attacker to exploit or to use in a way that it's not intended to be used.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jaime, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it is definitely a neat technique, and it's surprising that in Windows 10, they are still relying on ActiveX technology. Like, this was popular again, 10 years ago. And it was actually, a very important, threat vector for many of the early attacks against Internet Explorer specifically. And in the past, we saw similar attacks where attackers were actually exploiting ActiveX to do similar things. But also, I remember once where we found, a campaign that was actually using ActiveX, exploiting a vulnerability that will allow them to check which antivirus you were running and deciding whether or not to trigger the exploit based on a set of antivirus that they didn't like, and this was all from the browser. So similar to this case, I find this type of things fascinating. That the creativity from these guys, finding these vulnerabilities, it always surprised me.
Yeah, what's funny is even right now with a Windows 10 machine updated with a recent version of Microsoft Word, you can still go in and you can still add in like a Windows Media Player ActiveX control. And in the source, you can change the URL from some video on your system or on the internet. You can change it to like some drive. And of course, when that document loads, it needs credentials to get into that drive most likely, and so it's going to send those credentials. But the problem is, what if I set it to a attacker-controlled machine? What if I put my IP in there and I'm listening for that, and now I've got like a net TLM hash or something. So it's still doable in today's world, despite ActiveX controls and macros being really not used legitimately very, very much at all. So it's interesting that we have sophisticated malware still relying on kind of older technology.
Because they're relying on older technology, because there exist so many older devices, maybe controls.
Yeah.
So there is not really need for them to move away from them. Maybe whatever the new technologies, tactics they're coming, actually they kind of complement with whatever the existing methods they are using it.
Right.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Every time we hear some new tactic either by Emotet. Emotet is basically one of the major deliveries for TrickBot and other malware. So they're constantly evolving. They're trying to come up with new ways to basically evade detection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And they often do.
Yeah,
they often come up with new ways that we have to play catch up on a little bit.
Yeah.
But let me ask you, Ganesh. If I'm a normal person, I'm not a security-minded individual. How do I protect myself against something like this?
I think again it goes to the Jaime told before some recommendations. I think in this case again user education is important. Forget about ActiveX controls, all those things. But if something seems to be not right, probably it's not right.
Most likely.
I think that would be the best defense. And when in doubt, as Jaime pointed out, either go to the security person or maybe just don't pay attention to it. If it's really needed, you will get some follow-up, some sort of follow-up to that one.
Right.
I think that would be the best defense in this case, other than trying to have a layered defense in your approach.
Right. Yeah. From an enterprise perspective, there are a lot of. That's a loaded question, how to defend yourself, because there's a lot of different things you can do. But just from a citizen's perspective, just a normal person, everything you said is great. Don't enable macros. I don't think I've ever opened a Microsoft Word document that was legitimate that I needed to see that required me to enable macros. So just you should see that, and sort of it should bring up a nice big red flag there.
Yeah. I think personally, as I want to see by default macros should be disabled. Maybe ActiveX controls.
Yeah.
Those will help a long way to the most of the users.
Right.
If somebody is needed, then they can make a decision whether to activate or not.
Right,
maybe talk to someone who is really security savvy, maybe administrator. I think that kind of helps a little bit.
No, I agree, and and if we're throwing out suggestions there, why don't we go the macOS approach? And if you want to run an ActiveX control, you've got to enter in your admin password or something. Something that really makes the user stop and say, wait,
maybe
why do my
think for a second?
Right. Why does this Word document need my password? That's kind of weird.
Yeah.
Instead of just you click on this little enable button and they're off to the races. So.